When you are talking to the North Koreans of older age, now residing overseas, in South Korea and elsewhere, they are very sentimental and nostalgic about the old system. That all important speeches of the North Korean politicians had to be first. The text of the speeches had to be shown to their Soviet supervisors and had to be formally authorized by the Soviet military command and then the Soviet embassy. But the problems, which basically were an unavoidable result of his father's policy, began to be visible, began to be seen only under Kim Jong-il watch. So the average North Korean doesn't like him.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hey guys, today is my pleasure to welcome Professor Andrei Lankov, a Korean studies expert who currently lectures at Kookmin University in Seoul, South Korea. Today's discussion will focus on his book, The Real North Korea: Life and Politics in the Failed Stalinist Utopia, and modern Korean history and politics in general. Thank you, Professor Lankov, very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Could you provide an introduction of the book for the audience?
The book is, it's not so much the history of North Korea. It's largely an attempt to explain how and why, how North Korea has become a country we sort of know, why did it happen, and also explains the behavior of the North Koreans, of the North Korean leaders, because normally and frankly, we know very little about the common North Koreans, and their impact on the decision-making is pretty close to zero. When it comes to people who are movers and shakers of the North Korean politics, they are usually seen as pathetic and comical and irrational, and it's completely wrong. The book explains why they are doing things which at the first glance look a bit strange. For example, for many decades, the outside observers have been saying that North Koreans should see the light and emulate China and create an enlightened, successful, rich, well, at least reasonably affluent developmental dictatorship, Chinese style. Chinese style, openness and reforms, everybody has been saying for 30 years, maybe a bit more, 40 years, is the way to save the country. But they don't see it that way. And you know what, they're probably right. And talking about the nuclear weapons, after Iraq, after Ukraine, after Iran, well, it's increasingly clear that the only guarantee of state survival, of a relatively small state survival in the modern world, is not some nice piece of glossy paper with fine or not so fine, good-looking script, some good-looking script, good-looking, some international treaty. But, well, it has been for millennia, modern weapons. And such small states, relatively small states, well, they usually have problems with creating massive conventional capability. So, nuclear weapons is their, basically, tools of choice. The way to ensure that nobody would attack such a state. And I'm not saying that such a state is a nice place. Most of the above-mentioned states, not all, are definitely not the place where me or most of people who are listening to us would like to live, have we been given a choice. Nonetheless, Nonetheless, if you are an elite member, if you belong to the top 1% in any of such a state, you are definitely interested in keeping it alive and going. And North Korean elite has been quite successful in keeping North Korea afloat. Yes, in many cases, their policies was a disaster for the vast majority of population. But the survival and prosperity of the common North Koreans is not the major item on their agenda. Let's not demonize them, they care about it. But much more, they care about their own survival and their own power. They would like their people to be affluent and well-fed and healthy, as long as they are staying in control, or at least alive. And in the North Korean case, staying in control for the North Korean elite is basically means to stay alive. These people are afraid, and maybe with reasons. If they lose power, they will lose freedom and maybe their life. They are cornered. And this is the logic I'm talking in my book. It's a very sad story, actually. If you look at the history of North Korea, it's a very sad story. It's a story of selfless idealists, brutal, ready to die, ready to kill, for what they believe to be a great dream. But they discovered that they could not deliver what they hoped to get, and maybe their great dream was simply undeliverable. But when they discovered it in the 1960s, this communist idealists dreaming about building communist paradise in the world, and above all in their own country and for their own country, because East Asian communists were usually nationalists, much more nationalistic than communists elsewhere, which, well, there are good reasons for that. Once they basically discovered that the communist paradise they promised and expected did not look like, well, a paradise, but they were already prisoners of their own situation, and they saw no way out. In order to stay alive, to protect their families, protect their privileges, but also their lives, they had no choice but to continue with policies which are basically not very good for the vast majority of population and for their neighbors. But they are cornered, and frankly, I don't see any good solution now. When I was writing the book 15 years ago, the first edition, I used to believe that such a solution exists. Probably it did exist back then, 15 years ago, but not anymore. They are stuck in their sorry situation, and it's not nice.
Thank you. In your book, you describe how what happened in North Korea during the late 1940s was both a foreign occupation and also a popular revolution. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, because it's a kind of a usual discussion in the South Korean history circles. The South Korean historians are arguing what did happen in North Korea in the late 1940s. Most of the South Korean historians of that period of modern history, most of them are seriously left-leaning. They have a great deal of socialist and even communist sympathies, and they try to see North Korea in a very favorable light. So they usually insist that in the late 1940s, there was an authentic popular revolution in North Korea. To support this argument, many of these historians are committing what I would describe a historian's mortal sin. They overlook well-known and published evidence which probably would appear to be incompatible with their politically motivated views. But I'm not attacking them. because to a very large extent, I'm of the same opinion. I simply a bit upset to see the political motivation, which is way too obvious, and a lot of manipulation behind their argument. Above all, as I said, a very chosen, a very selective use of the available sources. Having said that, a small minority of the right-wing historians, and it's a very rare animal in South Korea nowadays, a right-wing historian of the modern Korea. Having said that, such surviving animals, rare animals, and these rare species, they usually claim that it was, something like a foreign occupation, that the evil foreign Soviet and Russian troops, they came to Korea and they forced on the Koreans a system they did not want. And they also do a great deal of the selective use of the available sources. But if you look at the sources, you see that on one hand, the Soviet control over the North Korean state at the first years of its existence was truly overwhelming. So it's suffice to say that until 1948, if you committed a political crime in North Korea, you wouldn't be sent normally to a North Korean prison. You would be sent to a Soviet prison, to the Soviet prison camps, usually in Siberia or elsewhere. That all important speeches of the North Korean politicians had to be first. The text of the speeches had to be shown to their Soviet supervisors and had to be formally authorized by the Soviet military command and then the Soviet embassy. Every agency had a Soviet advisor, usually ethnic Korean, by the way, a Soviet Korean, who was number two. And I can continue. The most interesting part, we have basically a wealth of documents. We show that most of the laws which were passed in North Korea between 1945 and 1948 were actually written by the Soviet advisors and just translated to Korean, like the Land Reform Law of 1946. And there is a very interesting declassified and published exchange about the North Korean Constitution, who was personally edited by Joseph Stalin. Having said that, we have other evidence. We saw that the land reform, yes, initiated, planned, and to a very large extent executed by the Soviet military authorities, was very popular.
That's interesting.
We can see all traces of the authentic, genuine enthusiasm for the new system, because a significant part of the Koreans at that time, I would dare to say a majority, a clear majority, they were very positive towards the ideas of socialism, equality, equal distribution, something they saw as a fair society, a society based on the social justice. Probably it was an illusion. I'm not going to get into this political argument. But as a historian, you see that these ideas, maybe utopian, maybe dangerously utopian, were extremely popular with the average Korean. The Soviets brought their system. But this system, these ideas of the Soviet military command, resonated extremely well with what the average Korean farmer, and at the time something like 85% of the North Korean population were farmers. It was what the average Korean farmer wanted to have. They were promising the society the average Korean, most of them at least, would like to live in. So, and when these changes began, the newly created government agencies, they relied on a large support from below. There were people who joining the party, who were joining this new groups, and not only for the promotion. Yes, it did matter. But many of these people during the Korean War, they were willing to fight, they were willing to die for their cause. And of course, they were willing to commit great atrocities for their cause. Because during the Korean War, both sides committed a great deal of slaughter. And again, I see how many historians in Korea, depending on the political views, tend to emphasize either atrocities committed by the right or atrocities committed by the left. But the more I read about it, the more the more clear, the more I have a greater and greater certainty that basically these people who have essentially the same cultural background, the same ideas about the value of human lives, well, in regards to their cruelty, in regards to their political passion, in regard to their willingness to use violence, they were not very different. Right or left, it did not really matter. When it came to sometimes killing civilians of suspicious background who looked too communist or too anti-communist, or when it probably came to sacrificing their own lives. As I have said, it was not a clear-cut morality tale. It was a real history which is bloody and dirty.
In the book, you discuss how North Korea from the late 1940s to the early 1990s had the most command economy and society out of all the socialist states. Could you discuss that?
Yeah, it's quite easy. Basically, Kim Il-sung and people around him, probably relying on a tacit support from the majority of the North Korean population, wanted to have a distribution-based economy. They were deeply suspicious of money. In their ideal world, a benevolent state would basically decide how much every single citizen should consume. And this quota should be delivered to the citizen essentially free of charge. All communist economies tended to have rationing and distribution systems. But none of, at least in peacetime, none of other state socialist economies was so much committed to the ideas of rationing and distribution. And if you have a look through works of Kim Il-sung, the founding father of the North Korean state, a number of times explicitly said that distribution and rationing is preferable to the free trade because it's fair. There was a case in, if I remember correctly, 1978, Kim Il-sung talking about the late 1950s, when the comprehensive, universal distribution system was introduced in the country, when it became illegal to buy and sell grain privately. Talking about it, he said that back then, some officials, some party cadres suggested to have free trade in grain and essential foodstuff, staple foodstuff. And he said that it would be a very bad idea. He said that the current distribution system, when actually my explanation, at that time in the late 1970s, every North Korean, depending on his or her age and occupation, was eligible to a certain daily ration of grain, which was delivered at token price, essentially free of charge. If you were, say, a white-collar worker, you would be given 700 grams of grain per day, essentially free of charge. And Kim Il-sung said that this is a good system because it's fair and it makes certain that all people in our country feel themselves secure. They don't worry about their future. And it was basically the attitude of the North Korean government. In essence, by, say, the early 1970s, free trade sort of disappeared. Grain was distributed by the central government, and they even had, and still have, a special government ministry, which is responsible for the grain distribution. And on top of that, pretty much everything, socks, underwear, running shoes, towels, soap, name it, was distributed by the local agencies, which, by the way, meant that you had universal, nationwide rationing quotas, rationing norms, which were universal in any part of the country. A white-collar worker would get his or her 700 grams of grain per day. It was the nationwide standard. But if you were living in a country, in a county where they had a chicken farm, you probably would get an 10 eggs per month. And if you were not so lucky, if the county of your residence had no chicken farm, you probably would get 2 or 3 eggs per month. But still, it was almost impossible for you to go to get some money and go and buy it. Yes, markets existed, but they were deliberately limited. Until the mid-1980s, it was illegal to have markets within the city limits. It was illegal to have more than one market per county. And markets, with few exceptions, could be operational only once every 5 or once every 10 days. And also strict controls on what could be sold at these markets. So the government essentially decided how many eggs you should eat, how much grain you should consume, and how many socks you are going to be issued per year. But it was all these items were given at heavily discounted prices. And North Korean leaders believed that it was a very good idea. And you know what? When you are talking to the North Koreans of older age, now residing overseas, in South Korea and elsewhere, they are very sentimental and nostalgic about the old system. Now, North Korea has essentially, to a very large extent, a heavily privatized economy. Private businesses exist. Most of the retail is actually operated according to the principles of the market economy. And many people don't like it. They feel nostalgic about the days when everybody was given 700 grams of grain, or if he or she was doing heavy work, 900 grams, or if he or she was a high school student, 500 grams, and so on. There were very complicated tables, free of charge. And now when North Korean government occasionally tried to revive the distribution system, and recently, in recent few years, their efforts have been sort of successful, do you know how they describe it? They say they are normalizing food supply. For them, rationing is not a sign of emergency. It's something normal. And they promise to go to this old normal as soon as possible. Younger generations, they have different ideas. But the older generations, they probably would welcome it.
I see. In the book, you discuss why North Korea, unlike most socialist states, did not collapse after 1989. Could you expand on that?
Because the North Korean elite has no exit option. What's happened in the communist bloc? It's a long story, and even if I provide you a kind of very short version of this long story, it will take few hours. But in a nutshell. In a nutshell, people in the communist bloc were disappointed because they discovered that the socialist system was remarkably bad in delivering consumer, basically in improving their consumer lives. They kept comparing themselves with people living in the free market capitalist societies nearby, and they discovered that their consumer life was impoverished and boring, that all items, all goods they had to deal with were of low quality and so on. However, it was only part of the story. What was most important in the case of the communist states was the position of the of the younger generation of the officials. It's paradoxically, when you look at the situation, when you ask yourself one question, which social group in the Soviet Union, or many, not all, but many East European countries, benefited most from the collapse of the Soviet system, you are likely to be surprised to learn that it was largely the old Communist Party nomenclatura, the Communist Party officials. A recent study of the top elite in Russia indicated that roughly 60% of the top Russian officials are either former members of the Communist Party bureaucracy or children of such members, 2/3. And I can assure you, Russia has a bad media now in the West, not without reasons. But if you look at some friendly and democratic countries with the same background, like say Baltic states, you will see very similar picture. The elite in the communist bloc countries at some point realized that they, in case of the communist system collapse, if such a system is replaced by a free market economy, they are positioned to benefit a lot. The former managers of the state-owned enterprises had education, connections, experience, and above all, control over the state property, which they could easily remake into their private property. So they benefited a lot from the collapse of the socialist system. Once again, let's not simplify it. Personally, I believe that in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases, the majority of common people also benefited, but probably less than the former elite. However, going back to North Korea, it's not going to happen there, because North Korea is a divided country. And the North Korean elite, they understand perfectly well. If they lose control over the situation, their country is likely to be swallowed by the rich, I would say dirty rich South. Because in pure economic terms, the history of South Korea over the last 60 years was a history of almost unprecedented success, nearly miracle, while the history of North Korea was a history of disaster. And as a result, North Korea, which back in the late 1940s had slightly better macroeconomic indicators than South Korea, is now lagging behind, seriously lagging behind. The ratio in per capita income between two Koreas is something like 1 to 25 or 1 to 30. In other words, it means that South Korea's per capita GDP is roughly equal to those of France and Italy, while North Korean GDP is close to Nepal and Tanzania. And the North Korean elite understand, if the average North Koreans learn about this gap, and if they are not sufficiently afraid of the government, they are likely to do what East Germans did. In East Germany, back in the late 1980s, the gap between East and West Germany in terms of per capita GDP was 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. Between two carriers, I remind you, it's between 1 to 25 and 1 to 30. Massive difference. So, the North Korean elite understand. If they start doing any kind of reforms, if they lose power, everything, they are likely to provoke massive outbreak of the anti-government movement. And if it happens, they will lose power. And if they lose power, unlike, say, former Soviet Communist Party apparatchiks, or, I don't know, some Romanian Communist Party apparatchiks, they are unlikely to remake themselves, to redeem themselves into the liberal democratic politicians or entrepreneurs. They are likely to be marginalized completely because the South Koreans will come with their skills and their capital, and they will create a new economy from the scratch. And they don't need these ancient North Korean factories, which are probably more like museums of the technical history than centers of the modern manufacturing. And people who have control over these factories, they will have no future. And let's not forget, North Korea has always been a pretty repressive place, with number of people currently in prison as political criminals is between 50,000 and 100,000. A pretty large number. I would say a worldwide record for a country with population of 25 million people. And these people understand that if they lose power, they will be accused of human rights violations, probably real, probably alleged, but they understand that if they lose power, they will be unable to get position in the new system, and probably they will pay with their freedom and lives for such a political transformation, and they definitely don't want it. Therefore, the North Korean elite, starting from the ruling family, the Kim family, and they are obviously having a young princess who is 14 years old, but is already presented to the public as a genius of leadership, actually a guide star of leadership at the age of 14. Very brilliant girl, isn't she? So having said that, these people understand that if they lose power, they will have no future. And the bad part of the story is they're absolutely correct. You can tell that they're immoral. Well, maybe. But can you find me an elite which would care about prosperity of the common folks more than they care about their own physical survival? I don't think such elite has ever existed on the planet Earth. And they don't have escape option. If you are losing political struggle in most countries, even in authoritarian countries, your chances of being killed or sent to prison are real but slim. Most likely you will go to some countryside estate, writing your memoirs, in order to prove everybody that you have always been right and everybody around has been wrong. Usual pastime of the retired politicians, isn't it? However, they cannot do it. They're afraid that the loss of power means loss of life or freedom at least. Or maybe if they are lucky, they will do pizza delivery. It's not what they want. And they are willing to keep the system under control. And this is exactly the reason why they are so deadly afraid of the Chinese-style reforms and openness. People say China did it, nothing happened, but China is not a divided country. Chinese are perfectly aware that Americans or Japanese are living much better, but they don't see it as a political issue because it's a prosperity of foreign countries. And in the case of North Korea, if they learn about prosperity of the South, which is by their standards is truly unbelievable, it will be what? It will not be a prosperity of some foreign nation. It will be a prosperity of their brethren. Prosperity of people who are part of the same nation. It's not incidental that now, over the last few years, Kim Jong-un keeps insisting that North Korea and South Korea are two different states and two different nations. The goal is simple: to minimize the risks I have been just talking about, to persuade the North Koreans that they should not see South Korea, they should not see South Koreans as fellow members of their nation. Maybe, if such education/propaganda activity continues for decades, they will succeed, but not right now. So, the North Korean government has to be, first of all, quite repressive, to make sure that people would not have some stupid ideas about protesting or anything, or creating any kind of independent groups. It has to do its best to keep the country isolated from the outside world and avoid all dangerous reforms. They can do some economic reforms, and they did try. Now it's impossible because of the UN Security Council sanctions. But in the, say, 10 years ago, between 2012 and 2019, they were serious about emulating Chinese economic policy, but only economic policy, not the openness. And right now, it's impossible because they cannot emulate Chinese policy. Chinese policy was export-oriented, and they cannot sell anything. It's illegal, it's banned. So what do? They basically rely on the Chinese aid and sales of ammunition and soldiers to Russia. And you know what? They're getting some income. Not good. Not good. Meager by standards of most countries, but by their standards, it's quite good. Life is getting better again, at least in the last 2 or 3 years. I don't think it's sustainable, but right now, they are likely to be supported and kept afloat by the Chinese and maybe the Russians. And if this is the case, if they get a kind of subsistence level support, well, they can live like that for decades.
Interesting. North Korea has had 3 leaders: Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. How different or similar were they as leaders?
Very different. A very different background, very different goals. Kim Il-sung was a peasant revolutionary, a successful field commander. He was not very well educated, but had a gut feeling of a professional politician. He also spent his youth fighting for the cause. He believed in his ideology, which was a funny mix of simplified Marxism, or should we say Marxism-Stalinism, and nationalism. You can be critical of these ideas as much as you like, but he was a true believer. And in many regards, he was a very traditional man. Believer in patriarchy, ideas of the national glory, and so on. Tough. Sometimes brutal. His son, Kim II, Kim Jong-il, very different. In normal life, he would probably become a bohemian, an artist, an actor, a TV operator or movie producer, or movie director. He was soft. He, of course, wanted to stay in power, and when necessary, he made tough decisions, which spelled death for many fellow North Koreans, but he was not happy about it. And actually, he was quite a soft person, and he was also unlucky, because he had to deal in his relatively short rule, 1994 to 2011, 17 years, he had to deal with problems largely created by his father's decisions. But the problems, which basically were an unavoidable result of his father's policy, began to be visible, began to be seen only under Kim Jong-il watch. So the average North Korean doesn't like him. For the average North Korean, Kim Jong-il, the second Kim, is a person responsible for famine, for economic devastation, and for the most difficult period in Korean history within the living memory. The arduous march, as they politely and nicely call a famine of the late 1990s. Kim Jong-un is different again. When he came to power, he wanted obviously to do changes, to increase economic efficiency, and he actually designed, or at least approved, relatively efficient and interesting new policies. But he was stuck by the sanctions, and now his policy is largely about survival. But he is determined to keep his country alive and his family at the helm. And I'm not sure which one is more important for him. I'm pretty sure that when he is thinking about it, he finds wonderful justification of his policy. He probably says that he is keeping protecting the North Korean nationhood, its identity, which of course cannot be protected by anybody but the Kim family. So the fate of the royal family and the country is essentially the same. Sounds nice, and maybe some people at the top really believe it, because people tend to believe some stories which justify their actions and make their actions look noble. Having said that, he, as I have said, he is determined to keep the country alive. It's much more important for him than for his father, because with the second Kim, you sometimes had an impression that he did not really care about survival of his state, at least in the long run, after his own physical death. Kim Jong-un is different. The third Kim wants to stay in power, and he is busy training a successor. Strangely enough, it's a daughter, not a son. And he is laying foundation for her to run the country for decades to come. And then maybe his grandson or granddaughter, sometime in, say, well, maybe the year 2085. I cannot rule it out. Having said that, it's very different. They are different. And talking about the young princess, it's too early to say. She is young, and nobody knows much about her character, about her personality, about her political views. And at any rate, your political views in the age of 14 might be very different from your political views in the age of 35.
How committed is the current leadership in North Korea to communism and Marxism?
Kim Il-sung was committed, maybe. Kim Il-sung, who died, when? 30 years ago, the first Kim. And even his own ideas of Marxism would probably greatly surprise Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin or Joseph Stalin. Talking about the next generation, they are pragmatic politicians. They are not committed at all to these imported ideologies, even though they find it useful to cite these ideologies whenever it's good for keeping people under control, including ideological control. Their major value is state survival. And if they see that some other systems can be introduced without creating any unnecessary risks for the survival of the state and their own power, they will happily introduce such a system. And like China, they can actually easily switch completely to the private economy if it can be done safely from their political point of view, and it seemingly is difficult. And of course, they will claim that it's a kind of, socialism with the North Korean characteristics, not because they believe it themselves, but because they want common people to believe it. Because they understand that sudden changes in ideology will probably create some chaos in hearts and minds of the common people. And it's not a good idea. If you want to run a stable system, you should not surprise common people. They should believe in the continuity, in stability, and so on.
You recently uploaded a video on your YouTube channel discussing all South Korean presidents. Out of curiosity, who do you think was the best and the worst South Korean president?
Very complicated issue. Personally, I believe, talking about bad presidents, well, Yoon Suk-yeol, the most recent president with his stupid idea of military coup, was quite bad. Syngman Rhee, the founding father of the South Korean state, he basically, he established the state. He was quite good in handling Americans, to be frank, manipulating Americans, playing all other great powers whenever necessary. But at the same time, he was willing to turn a blind eye at corruption. Himself, Syngman Rhee, was not probably corrupt, but he was willing to tolerate corruption. And he was not very efficient in running economy. So, Chon Duk-hwan in the 1980s, very controversial person. He was unbelievably corrupt, but he stole a lot of money, massive bribes, some of which, however, were not used for his personal consumption, but as a necessary fuel for the economic growth and basically maintaining political stability. So it's a bit more complicated. At the same time, under Chon Duk-hwan, and the Chon Duk-hwan was quite repressive and violent. At the same time, he managed to maintain high level of the economic growth. And as a result, probably this better nutrition and better medicine, which was delivered because the country was getting rich, saved many more people than were killed by his secret police. Sorry for such a cynical argument, but I believe it's how a professional, unbiased historian should see it. So it's a difficult issue. I'm not sure. As I should count Chon Duk-hwan among the bad presidents. As a personality, he was not nice, of course. But, being nice is not a part of president's job. Talking about people whom I see in very positive lights, Park Geun-hye, dictator, under whose watch North Korea became one of very few poor countries which managed to become rich. And as a matter of fact, it's not widely understood. Korea is probably the world's only former colony which now has per capita GDP higher than their former imperial master country. Korea has a higher per capita GDP than Japan. I don't see you can find any other colony with such data, with such dynamics, unless this is some oil-producing country. Having said that, Park Geun-hye laid the foundation. And a person whom he hated and nearly got killed, and person who probably would be happy to kill Park Geun-hye. I'm talking about Kim Dae-jung, who was president in the late 1990s and who essentially established a stable democracy in Korea. And he worked very hard to make Korea a democracy. So Park Geun-hye was the person who created foundation for the economic success, and Kim Tae-jun was the person who made Korea into a modern democracy, arguably the only of, well, not maybe the only, not anymore, one of the first functioning operational democracies in Asia. They hated one another, but is it relevant? Well, I don't think so.
What do you think is the future for both Koreas? Could there be unification under the North or under the South?
You can see I believe that talks of unification has never been anything but an empty rhetoric. Peaceful negotiated unification has never been possible. And North Koreans finally admitted it recently. But talking about unification, I see scenarios which are not very nice. That is conquest. It's still possible theoretically for basically any of the two Korean states to prevail through military or semi-military means, or a kind of scenario, a kind of possible version of the same scenario. We can talk about a revolutionary change in one of the Korean states. Now it's highly unlikely to be South Korea, even though a few decades ago it could be South Korea. Now it's only North Korea. Essentially German scenario. You have a revolution, regime collapse, followed by takeover. But it's definitely not a peaceful, negotiated unification. And you know what? If you look at the 20th century, well, it's history of the world after 1945, there have been only 5 cases of the state unification, of which 2 successful cases, Germany and Vietnam, were achieved by the use of force. In Germany it was more complicated. It was a revolution in East Germany, which was followed by the takeover. It was still not unification. East Germany was swallowed by West Germany. It's not incidental that the official name of the unified German state is the Federal Republic of Germany. Having said that, 3 other attempts of negotiated unification, which are largely forgotten: Yemen, Senegambia in the 1980s, and United Arab Republic in the 1950s, 60s, ended in collapse. So, even if you don't have such a level of hostility and political mistrust, I would say well-founded political mistrust, and internal contradictions, the level we see in Korea, even without such a level, negotiated unification of 2 different sovereign states is a difficult or nearly impossible task.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book?
Well, basically, I think it's Amazon or other online sellers is the best place now, because it was published more than 10 years ago, the second edition exactly 10 years ago. I don't think you can find it in many shops, bookshops, but well, fortunately, internet has been invented to make our life much easier.
Professor Lankov, thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you continued success in your work.
With pleasure. Thank you very much.